Anyway, welcome to this Taylor Talk. Taylor Talks are a quarterly series that focus on the history and culture of Mesilla, the Mesilla Valley, and the borderlands. My name is Tom Dormady, and I am the Secretary for the Board of Directors for the Friends of the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. There are different groups that help make Taylor Talks possible, including my group, the Friends, but also our wonderful staff with the Department of Cultural Affairs and the Historic Site. And we have members of the staff here today. Alexandra, Daniel, and Matt is with DCA. He's going to be our presenter today. They're doing a great job. It's also a partnership with the town of Mesilla and their government. They provide the auditorium for us and are helping us in many ways. And finally, members of the Taylor family. Mary Helen's here. Anybody else from the family? No. The family generously, kindly donated their home and 2 storefronts and their collections to the State of New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs to make up the Taylor-Mesilla Historic Site. And we're very appreciative of the family for that wonderful gift. In the back of the room, we've got representatives of the Friends Membership Committee. If you have an interest in joining the Friends or making a donation to the Friends, Heather back there can talk to you about that. And then we have representatives of the Friends Barella store, the gift shop, which they're selling books today, including the book, Ana Pacheco's book on J. Paul Taylor, and Mary Daniels Taylor's book on the history of Mesilla, the early history from 1848 to 1872. And I just finished reading that book for the second time, and it really does live up to its title of Places Wild as the West Ever Was. That's a wonderful book, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So the Barella store folks are here, Kathy and Mary Helen, and there's the Barella store itself is located out of the plaza next to the Reynolds Store Visitor Center for the historic site. And you can enter the store from the plaza, or if you go on a house tour. How many have gone on a house tour? A self-guided or a guided house tour? So we hope you can all do that. And if you go on a house tour, you can enter the Barella store from the zaguan or hallway where you start and finish your house tour. Okay? So this is a time now, too, if you have a cell phone, make sure you put it on silent mode. And as you can see, today's topic is an archaeological perspective on hunting in New Mexico. And we're very fortunate to have as our speaker today, Matt Barbour. And some facts about Matt is he holds a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Arts in Anthropology from the University of New Mexico, and has worked for the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs since 2002. Currently, Mr. Barbour is the Deputy Director of New Mexico Historic Sites. So he's looking after all 8 of our historic sites. Throughout his 22-year career, he has published over 200 nonfiction articles and monographs. In 2012 and again in 2014, Mr. Barbour was awarded the City of Santa Fe Heritage Preservation Award for Excellence in Archaeology. In 2018, under Mr. Barbour's management, Coronado Historic Site received an Award of Merit from the American Association for State and Local History. Then in 2019, the Jemez Historic Site received the Archaeology Heritage Preservation Award from the New Mexico Preservation Division. We just learned, and I just shared this with Matt, that on January 31st of this year, the Taylor family, Department of Cultural Affairs, and the Taylor-Mesilla Friends will be recognized by the Doña County Historical Society with their Noteworthy Restoration or Renovation Award for 2026. So we're all very excited about that, and Matt and the DCA have had a huge role in this restoration. My colleagues and I have had the pleasure of collaborating with Mr. Barbour in developing the general operating agreement between the Friends and the Department of Cultural Affairs that guides our work together. So join me in welcoming Matt Barbour for his presentation.
Thank you, guys. It sounds like, based on my introduction, I mostly work in Santa Fe. That is not true. I've worked all throughout the state. I just happen to have some awards in Santa Fe. I did quite a bit of work when I'm still doing archaeology throughout the state, the Deming area. In fact, I spent several years down here, which I know Deming is not Las Cruces, but it's fairly close. I've worked in other parts of the southern parts of the state as well. This talk today is really talking about New Mexico as a whole, so the bias, hopefully there isn't a complete bias towards the north or south half of the state. The things I talk about in broad strokes will be applicable to both locations. In fact, I'll try to point out where I took data specifically from archaeological sites in southern New Mexico as we get to them. I'm sure I'll forget some, but fair enough. Also, these photographs are a mix of things that are associated with New Mexico Game and Fish and other state institutions. New Mexico, all those images are not necessarily owned strictly by New Mexico Historic Sites, but all of our partners within the state government. With that said, the focus of the talk today is on hunting, an archaeological perspective on hunting. This is not a perspective or a discussion about how hunting is great or hunting is awesome and I love hunting. I do like these activities, but really what we're trying to get at today is a broad overview of what hunting is, with the idea that hunting is a attribute of culture, that hunting, the practices of hunting change over time, that they are dependent upon what cultural groups you belong to or what your given perspectives are. Yes, you need calories to live, but how you acquire those calories is an aspect of culture. So therefore, we're going to be looking at it as an evolving ethnological or cultural trait, which can be studied through the archaeological record. And it can be studied a lot of different ways. So if you're talking about hunting, there's lots of different ways in the archaeological record we can see hunting practices as they existed through time. This can be everything from where sites, archaeological sites, are located, and the distribution through time can tell you a lot about what people are hunting for. Certainly landscape or human manufactured features. This is a hunting blind right over, this is on Quartzsite Ridge at the north end of Cook's Range. This is probably from the time period of proto-historic hunters and gatherers. There was a lot of later Apache occupation of the Cooks Peak area, but this is probably a little bit before what we would say is ethnically Athabascan peoples per se. Certainly other things you can see are things like flake stone technologies, projectile points, but also scrapers and things of that nature. Distribution and sourcing these materials certainly helps. Certainly fauna, the bones of the animals they ate and left behind can help, and human remains can actually help inform upon what people are hunting based upon nutritional deficiencies we see or occupational injuries that we can see in the archaeological record based upon what they were hunting. The goals of this lecture are really to talk about some broad periods of time. So because this is a New Mexico as a whole lecture, we're going to be talking about periods known as the Paleoindian, Archaic, Pueblo, and Historic periods. The time frames of those periods differ slightly depending upon the area you are in, but even though the north half of the state would say they have a lock on Pueblo peoples, that is not true. Southern New Mexico had a rich and diverse population of Pueblo peoples, if we call the Mogollon culture, and the broader distribution as well as other folks that came through this area. We're going to be talking about the Pueblo period, doesn't mean just Pueblo people as well. And we're going to be looking at how these changes reflect upon and are influenced by other cultural developments occurring at the same time. So how does the introduction of agriculture change hunting practices? How does the introduction of Europeans change hunting practices amongst indigenous peoples? This is going to be largely because human history is broad and European peoples have only been in the American Southwest, a relatively narrow point of time compared to our Native American friends. We're going to be talking about it as a whole and mostly talking about Native American hunting practices, but we will be talking about Spanish and Anglo near the end. I'm not going to, there are many people that instantly when I say hunting, they think of it as a guy's thing that guys do. That isn't necessarily true, and even if we were to look at all societies as a whole, even if statistically men are more likely to kill the animal, the processing of the animal, the treatment, the cooking of the food, all the other aspects that go into hunting are really all roles held by multiple people. So this is not gender-specific talk. And to be clear, gender roles can actually be quite fluid when we look at the archaeological record and the ethnological record based upon a number of cultural and environmental factors playing in there. So that is not necessarily, this is not a talk about dudes doing guy things and so on. It's really a talk about people in general. So I'm going to start with a map you've probably seen before in the current, like the three thoughts about how the New World was populated. There's a fourth thought, but that one may have happened in addition to one of these other three. The first one, if you probably grew up, we're looking at an older craft, you probably grew up hearing is that there was a land bridge across from Asia. People walked across the land bridge, and then there was an ice-free corridor through Canada, and they all came through the ice-free corridor, and they populated the Great Plains, and they kind of spread out from there. There's no evidence that there's a huge amount of early archaeology in the ice-free corridor. There is archaeological evidence of early people coming across an area near Alaska, but it's not in the ice-free corridor. There's another hypothesis that they actually came from Europe, and this is the Solutrean hypothesis, and you have to be really bendy and shifty with numbers to make it actually work, that the first Americans, first colonists to America were Europeans as opposed to Asiatic peoples. It doesn't really work out. Some people still believe it though, and you can look that up. The most likely way people got into North America was from Arctic foragers along the coast. We have good evidence. Unfortunately, most of the evidence, during the Ice Age, the water levels were actually lower than they are today. So most of the evidence is unfortunately underwater, which is why we don't just have a tremendous amount of evidence staring us in the face, but there is a substantial amount of evidence now, specifically linking these folks to hordes coming down as coastal migration. And you'll notice that if you look at this kind of chart here, you see the coastal migration hypothesis. They end up in California first, which is where they start to spread inland just a little bit, and then they hit the mountains again. We can argue that in terms of languages in California. California is one of the most rich areas for a diverse number of Native American languages, probably because Native Americans were there in large numbers way before anywhere else, which is why languages have changed about. Most of these early people, they're hunting like seals and walruses. They're actually probably closer culturally, technology-wise, to the Inuit peoples that you would see along the coast of Alaska today, and so on. There's also a possibility of a Polynesian connection in South America, which is not something I'm going to talk about today, because even if that Polynesian connection existed, it never made its way up into New Mexico. So just bear that in mind. But there is some cool data coming out on that Polynesians were probably aware of the New World prior to European contact. Now, how do they get into New Mexico? Well, the most interesting and coolest research that's going on right now is actually occurring in Sonora. Believe it or not, during the last Ice Age, Sonora was a swamp. And they had an animal known as a gaumont there, which I'm probably butchering that name, but think of it as a swamp elephant. There's a swamp elephant hanging around the coast in Sonora. And people appear to have hunted this swamp mammoth goes extinct really early on. But it appears that human beings were hunting the swamp mammoth. So these coastal foragers decide that, hey, if we change our tool set a little bit, we can hunt this swamp mammoth. And from there, it's not a big jump from going after mammoths further north into Arizona. So they actually pursue these large animals as they develop distinctive kit that we know is probably Clovis culture in the swamps of Sonora. They then start to move up through the San Pedro Valley into the American Southwest, which is also why when we talk about American evidence, United States evidence, for early Clovis period archaeology and stuff like that, we're really talking mostly about the San Pedro Valley in Arizona and then into New Mexico and elsewhere. That's not to say there weren't human beings on the landscape before then. There is some evidence of people perhaps in white sands before that time. We don't know necessarily what, that evidence is so limited, we don't know what those people were doing if they predate Clovis culture. By Clovis culture, we know what they're doing. They actually have a really nice distinctive toolkit associated with hunting these swamp mammoths. And this period in which these peoples come up from Sonora and into New Mexico and start to establish a culture here, we call the Paleoindian Period. And it's a period in which it's characterized by highly mobile big game hunters using large lancelet projectile points. So these big kind of spear points on a spear thrower, dart thrower. It's a long stick that just makes your arm. You can actually see folks here throwing these things, though they don't have the allows in the picture, unfortunately. There's usually argued to be 3 complexes in the American Southwest. The first that you're probably most familiar with is Clovis. The second is Folsom, and the third is Plano. They have slightly different points. Clovis is a larger point with a flute. Folsom is a smaller point with a flute. Plano or Plainview is usually no flute. Those are the big differences between the 3. There's also a difference in what they're hunting during that period, which is why we have those complexes and differences in technology. These are the differences. These are the projectile points, as you can see here, dating to slightly different time periods. Paleoindian projectile points are large and heavy. They're designed to take on large game in relatively short instances. They're literally made to go up to the elephant-like creature and shoot it. You can also jab it. Point morphology during these early phases of human history, we're going to talk about primarily the Paleoindian or Archaic period, are temporally diagnostic. So if you find a given type of projectile point on the ground, chances are it's associated with that time period. That said, people did reuse projectile points, so you have to look at the whole assemblage as a whole. Just because you find a Clovis point doesn't mean you're on a Clovis site. You can find a Clovis point on a Pueblo site and so on and so forth. Paleo-Indian strategies appear to have started with an ambush of large game around marshes and shallow lakes. Yes, that, once again, Sonora, that reads right. If you want to believe in the Sonoran hypothesis for Clovis peoples, they literally start hunting animals around marshes because that's what they were familiar with. They also focus on an area, and this is really prevalent if you start looking at the Paleo-Indian period outside of Albuquerque, on the west side, in the East Mountain area, in the Moriarty area. The hunting by Paleo-Indian peoples around these large playas or shallow lakes. Believe it or not, the Estancia Basin, which has some small lakes today, was actually a large lake at one point in the past. And it's just kind of dried up as years have gone by. They have these large shallow playas, which were really common in the Southwest during this time period. The animals would have to go get water. Human beings would literally set up ambushes at these locations. This was the popular hunting strategy during the Clovis period, and it was kind of transitions into, as they decide the animals are getting smart, they don't necessarily go down to the water when human beings are there. They start to focus more on driving these animals off cliffs or into corrals so they can be killed in mass. This is it's an Antiquus kill site in, I think this one's in Colorado because I could not find a good picture of one in New Mexico. But they do exist in New Mexico, or we believe they exist in New Mexico at several locations. The latter technique for hunting these things required lots of people to be really coordinated in what they were doing. It also, unfortunately, led to a lot of waste. This might sound horrible, but like you kill an elephant, even early on, they didn't have enough people to turn the elephant around. So a lot of times what we see based upon the playa deposits and stuff like that is probably only about half the animals actually processed. And certainly when you're doing these kind of stampede hunts where you corral a whole bunch of animals, you work to preserve as much as you can, but unfortunately you're dealing with a lot of waste. That lot of waste leads to a lot of extinction. Human arrival in the New World coincides with massive extinction event throughout North and South America. This might sound controversial to say, but reality is when Aborigines got to Australia, we saw the exact same thing. It's literally the way human beings act. It's not Native Americans being wasteful. It's the nature of human beings. That's both in impacts of predation, environmental degradation, and it's still poorly understood in the case of North and South America. However, we can go in like an order of what animal got extinct first. And once again, swamp elephant goes extinct first, then mammoth, then bison antiquus. And literally at that point, we're looking at the introduction of Clovis, the height of Clovis period, and then the Folsom period. All the extinction of all those animals just going in a nutshell. This is not It shouldn't be news to people that this occurred. It can be hard to understand because it wasn't just the hunting. We also had some broader changes in our environment occurring during this time. So it's unclear if these animals, if humans just pushed them over the edge per se, not a bison jump, but like literally just made the populations decline because they put a little bit of pressure on them, and that was just enough that they were already hanging on by a thin thread, or if it was literally humans caused all of it. We're not sure of that. But the extinction of these animals, so like when your hunting is focused on these animals, and they did hunt other things, but if your hunting is focused on these animals, when these animals go away, you've got to diversify. And really, the end of the Paleoindian period is characterized as the diversification of hunting traditions, or the diversification in resources for calories. This includes plant resources. This is a mono and metate. I think this is in the Deming area. This actually, it may be out by Hobbs. And it's staged. To be clear, it is staged. So don't think that, wow, they really came upon it. Anyway, and also the human population is growing at the same time, so as groups are starting to find themselves, restriction on like hunting areas are starting to grow, because you want your group to have a specific hunting area, and their group to have, it doesn't mean they don't overlap, but there is some restriction on that. This transition to a diversification of resources leads to a period archaeologists generally call the Archaic period. In northern New Mexico, it's known, in northwestern New Mexico, so the area of the Four Corners, it's known as the Oshara tradition. Down here, we usually don't use those terms, but the focus is the same either way. The Archaic tradition starts with it mostly being hunting, and it ends when they've pretty much transitioned to farming being the most important thing. So the Archaic period, sometimes we call it, we separate out from the Archaic period the early agricultural period here in the southern part of the state, because agriculture comes in so early on. But it really is just the whole time period is just a greater and greater adoption of plant resources. Plant resources become more and more important as time goes on. Doesn't mean they stop hunting, but these are the time periods you've got people living in ephemeral structures like this wiki up here. They're hunting a lot more like rabbits and small game. You see deer in the background. It's kind of focus away from large game. The Archaic tradition, just like the Paleo tradition before, is usually represented based on distinct projectile points. We'll get to that in a minute, I guess. I got another slide before that. See, that's why it's good to have slides. I'm not trying to what I'm actually saying. One of the things we see in the Archaic period a lot now, mind you, there had to be some seasonality to the hunting during the Paleoindian period, but our evidence for it is actually fairly limited in the archaeological record. By the Archaic period, you can absolutely see seasonality in what people are pursuing. So people are moving around on the landscape to capitalize on different resources as they mature at different time periods. These aren't just plant resources, but as plant resources are becoming more pivotal to their culture, what they're hunting is based upon what they can get in that area while they're capitalizing on the plant resources. You can't be hundreds of miles away when it's ready to harvest the mesquite. You want to be where the mesquite is, whether that's in the Mimbres Valley or whatnot. So hunting becomes more of an incidental activity during the Archaic period, an encounter activity rather than the focus of your culture. Archaic hunters are a jack of all trades. We see this in the rock art, and certainly in other ways. Opportunistic hunting strategies can change with environmental niche being exploited that season. So while pursuing native grasses along the river, you might hunt waterfowl and take fish with nets. If harvesting mesquite, you might be using a rabbit stick to take lagomorphs and other rodents such as rabbits. We'll be talking a lot more about the lagomorph index. Learn about a little bit. It's super exciting, I promise. Later on, but you'd be hunting rabbits and pinon stands if you're hunting, collecting nuts or something. It might also be ideal habitat for taking deer with an atlatl. Projectile points get much smaller during the Archaic time period. Doesn't mean they're necessarily always going after smaller game, but you'll also notice that the quality of the points. So if you say put your labor where if it's a tool that you require every day, it's your essential life tool. It can be really, really nice because you rely on that more than anything else. At this point, because hunting is just one of a set of circumstances by which you're getting calories from, projectile points are probably not not always, they can be quite beautiful. They can be works of art. They're not necessarily as large or prominent in the assemblage. They get smaller. You start seeing a lot more regional variability because people aren't moving around as much on the landscape, so everybody makes their own little projectile points during this time period. But morphology continues to be temporally diagnostic. Now, when I don't want to get into details about how archaeologists do their work, but one concept I want to put forward here that works really good in the Archaic period is optimal foraging theory, which is an idea that comes out of human evolutionary ecology to some extent. This is actually a chart that I used in my undergrad, and I was studying in my undergraduate for the Aceh people in South America. Optimal foraging strategy says that if all things are equal, you'll always take the highest, the game with the most calories. So if you have your option of a deer versus a rabbit, all things being equal, you hunt the deer. If there is no deer, you choose the rabbit before you choose the gopher, because the rabbit has more calories than the gopher does, and so on and so forth. So what you see here is a chart that prioritizes for South America, collared peccary at the top, deer, paca, coati, a whole bunch of armadillo, and kind of looking at how much calories you can get from it, and then ranking those animals so that you can look at perhaps environmental degradation on the landscape. If you go to an archaic site and there's no deer on there, the environment should have held deer. You can look at the fact that perhaps they've exhausted the deer resources. The only resources they have available are rabbits, and so on and so forth. And what happens with that is when you start to look at an archaeological assemblage, you start to see diet breadth. So diet breadth is very small. So if they're only hunting one or two animals, those are likely the highest calorie animals, and it means there's whole bunches of stuff in the landscape. They're probably specifically targeting those animals for whatever reason, because they're easy to hunt, because they're abundant, because the amount of effort to take those game is very, very little. If they're hunting everything under the sun and eating it, they're probably not doing very well because they have to have a wide diet breadth to get everything. I know we like diversity in our food nowadays. Prehistoric man is not necessarily looking for diversity in his diet. He's looking for the highest calories he can get out of everything he does. It's calorie game. It's a numbers game. Here's the diet breadth from the Archaic. This is actually from High Rolls Cave in southeastern New Mexico. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of diet breadth here, but there are large game in the assemblage. So mule deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, those are all very big animals. In fact, bighorn sheep is at the upper end of the spectrum for the American Southwest as far as how much meat you get off of it. But there's also things here that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily see as being high in calories. Prairie dog being one, wood rat being one. Wood rat's actually a common food at Jemez. They must have cooked it like a fritter, believe it or not, because they actually, later, weird stuff you learn later on in life. When I was doing a project up at Jemez later on, this is during the Pueblo period, we only found the intact leg bones of the wood rat. And it looks like what you did, based on what we can reconstruct from the bones, is that when you got a good wood rat, I don't know if this is true down here, I don't know if they boiled, we don't know if they fried it or boiled it or whatnot, but it seems like they took the wood rat and they smashed it up into like a big pile, almost like just not take out the bones, not skin it, just like smash it up really good inside of its little casing, almost like a sausage. And then you eat that. Because of the way the bones are processed. So it's just kind of interesting stuff you can get into. But diet breadth gets way more spread out in the Archaic. We'll get to that a little bit more. As the Archaic progresses, you start to see the adoption of agriculture. Once again, much earlier down here in southern New Mexico. It does come in, believe it or not, I know. It's a problem to explain everything that happens in New Mexico as diffusion up from Mexico, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is human populations were way more robust south of the border, and that they did, because those populations were more robust, cultures tended to get going on things quicker down there, and a lot of that stuff does push up into the American Southwest at different time periods. Agriculture is one of those things that also probably pushes up from central Mexico during the Archaic period. agriculture doesn't end mobility or hunting and gathering techniques, but it does eventually lead to sedentism. People stay year-round in a single place. But it's a slow process. It's actually a process of over several thousand years. But both sedentism and agriculture have impacts on hunting behaviors, which is why we usually separate it out to the next period, to the Pueblo period. This was the aggregation of Native Americans into large villages. Of course, this reconstruction here looks like a Pueblo you might see in the northern Rio Grande. It has kind of the aspects of that kind of a village, but certainly you would have similar villages, maybe not as many stories or as large down here, though there were some fairly large villages in the Mimbres area and elsewhere down here. They look slightly different than these. The Pueblo period, as far as hunting goes, we can actually start with human remains. So interestingly enough, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in my notes right off the top of my head, corn is either a C4 or C3 plant. And there are very few other C3 or C4 plants. And they can test how much C3 and C4 you have in your bones, carbon-4 and carbon-3 you have in your bones. If you have they can tell if your diet is largely corn or it's something else. The diet of Pueblo people, based upon bone evidence of Pueblo peoples, is 80%. So 80% of all the calories you take in as a Pueblo person was corn. Not squash, not beans, not deer, not rabbit. Most of your calories are corn. That is the real shift between the Archaic. So the Archaic, they had corn. Corn doesn't make up a huge amount of your diet. You're doing a whole bunch of different things. Diet bread expanded. You're processing a lot of different plants. You're doing Pueblo period is we're all in on corn. Corn is the greatest thing. Corn, corn, corn. In northern Rio Grande, we split this time period into the early developmental, late developmental, coalition, and classic. Down here in the Mogollon, depending on what portion of the Mogollon you're looking at, there's completely different separation. The reality is, either way you look at it, the Pueblo period is that period which, after the Archaic, now everybody's bought into corn, and prior to the arrival of Europeans. That would be the best definition. That does not mean everybody buys into corn. There are people that go, you know what, I live in an environment that could never do this agriculture, or I choose not to do these activities. And these people, who still continue in an archaic kind of lifestyle, continue to exist next to the Pueblo peoples. So while there are Pueblo peoples that go all in on corn, there's others that don't. These are your nomadic hunters and gatherers that exist during the Pueblo period. Depending on what portion of New Mexico, we might be talking about different people, but the people that you guys are probably most familiar with, if I use a common name, is the Apache. The Apache peoples of both southern and northern New Mexico certainly kept a hunter and gatherer lifestyle during this time period. Numic peoples, or the Utes, are another group of people that we would look at with that. And there's others as well, but mostly. Now, these guys are not living a pure archaic lifestyle because they, unlike the archaic peoples who didn't have any Pueblo peoples to trade with, these people have Pueblo peoples they can trade and raid with, so they can still get corn, they can still get those agricultural products to some extent. So they're still not living an exactly archaic lifestyle, but they're living fairly close. It's also during this time period, early on in this Pueblo period, that we finally see the adaptation of the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow doesn't come into place until about 1,500 years ago. It's a transition that takes about 200 years to fully take over. And when it takes over here, the atlatl goes away completely, which is interesting because the bow comes into Mesoamerica and it stays there and the atlatl continues. Here, for whatever reason, they just get rid of it. The bow is, in some ways, an easier technology to learn and use, which makes it ideal for both hunters and gatherers and farmers. It also has to do with the fact that most of the large game that they would have hunted with an atlatl no longer exists. This is perfectly okay. You can use both the bow and atlatl in war, and certainly like the Aztecs did. Certainly both tools have relevance, but here the bow took off. Diet breath, this is, I think, Arroyo Hondo. Yeah, it's Arroyo Hondo Pueblo, I think I pulled this one from. just east of Santa Fe. Looking at diet breadth, you'll notice that there's even more animals on the list of what's being eaten at Arroyo Hondo. Now, I specifically use this one, and you might say to yourself, well, all those things might have been eaten for meat. Maybe they were taken for other reasons. We'll get there in a second. But also Arroyo Hondo is a really bad one because literally by the end of Arroyo Hondo, people are starving. So this is what it looks like when it really, if you're looking at the archaeological record, you might go, man, pronghorn bison, they must have been eaten really good. No, exactly the opposite. The fact that there's so many different things here means they're trying to get their hand. Yes, somebody got lucky and got bison one time. Probably for every bison, there's a lot more of those wood rats or voles that they're eating. It doesn't mean very good, necessarily. In fact, most of the hunting during the Pueblo period amongst Pueblo kind of peoples living in villages, is what we would call garden hunting. So it literally is you're hunting those animals, those pests in your field. And sure, you hope that the pests in your field are deer and elk and stuff like that. They're probably way more often going to be your rabbits and your mice and stuff like that. This is actually a mural from Pueblo, Coronado Historic Site, one of our other historic sites. This is the only mural I can actually show in a public presentation. It shows a black-tailed jackrabbit being killed during a garden hunting scene. Interestingly enough, there are very few jackrabbits put in the murals. Do you guys want to guess what the #1 animal that ate at Pueblo was? If anybody wants to guess, other than an employee that has heard me talk before, employees can't answer, but anybody want to guess, you'll never guess it.
The marmot.
No. It's got wings.
No, bats.
No, bats. Believe it or not, it's Canada geese. And if that seems weird to you, interestingly enough, talk about humans changing their environment. One of the cool things, and this came out of a study from a grad student at UNN many years ago now, when I was in my career at this point. There's a great correlation as agriculture gets going in the American Southwest. Migratory birds end up changing their patterns and going more heavier along the Rio Grande corridor. So they actually created an environment in which the geese would really love it. And then geese became the main consumable. And interestingly enough, birds are actually the most common animal depicted in the murals of Pueblo. Not necessarily a spirit, I mean, some of them might be spiritual beings, but a lot of them are probably just what they ate. Rabbit hunts, though, in general for Pueblo communities, especially outside the Rio Grande, become like the main subsistence drives. It's literally a hunting activity where you get together as a community, drop lines, and you literally walk through the fields. All the animals that chase out in front of you, you kill them. In fact, it's you're considered a very virile man if you you get a lot of rabbits in Jemez culture. Take that for what it is. Anyway, it helps preserve your fields and it gets you meat. It doesn't say they did. It's not to say they didn't go out for hunting large game during times when agriculture was not a necessity. We actually see this today. In fact, if you go to the Pueblos today, you'll see deer dance being performed in the winter time, or buffalo dance. These are the time periods in which these dances occurred because this is the time when men were able to get away from the fields, or women were able to get away from the fields and pursue these animals. And interestingly enough, we have ethnographic evidence, early oral histories and some archaeological evidence to support this as well. Jemez would go out into eastern New Mexico to hunt buffalo during the winter. I know several other Pueblos had very, very long distances, so these Pueblo peoples, even though they're tied to these villages and are practicing sedentarism, which they're focused on agriculture or the field houses nearby, we still are getting these large groups going out to procure these larger meat sources when possible. In fact, some people have argued the reason you don't see many of these large animal bones, that people have actually made the counter-argument that perhaps you're seeing diet breadth and you're seeing these large game animals being hunted in smaller numbers. But if you're hunting buffalo out on the plains, if you're now having to go hundreds of miles away, you're not dragging back the bones of the animal. You're processing the animal out on the plains. So perhaps some of the archaeological sites we typically attribute to mobile hunters and gatherer groups during that time period are actually Pueblo peoples simply acting like hunters and gatherers for that short period of time to procure those resources, preserve them, and then bring them back to the Pueblo. Conversely, they can also be trading for these things as well. There's also a spiritual component to hunting, certainly by the Pueblo period. We'd probably make the argument that it probably existed during the Archaic period, but we don't have as much evidence for this kind of stuff. Certainly by the Pueblo period, we can see that not all animals are being consumed just for their caloric value. This is why that optimal foraging theory that was really good with hunters and gatherers kind of falls apart when you're dealing with more sedentary societies that may have a broader set of cultural traits that are not necessarily tied to hunting. Birds are taken primarily for their feathers. In fact, a turkey, which wasn't really hunted as much as it could have been, was mostly kept as a pet and fed, kept as long as they can. The feathers of the turkey were way more valuable than, turkeys. When you look at turkey feather blankets and the fact that we're looking at human remains, the infants being wrapped in them, turkey feather blankets probably your first possession as a human being in Pueblo societies during the Pueblo period. And certainly it takes a lot of feathers to do that. These blankets were very, very important items. In fact, prayer sticks today, even when you're burying somebody, it's going to likely have turkey feathers involved in it. Other feathers certainly all played a different role depending upon what you have. Other things like predator claws and teeth provided protection based upon our ethnographic analogies of what we know today. And consuming an animal could allow the hunter to be imbued with the spirit of the creature. So certainly you may be eating things that you wouldn't necessarily go, well, that's not a really smart choice if I'm just worried about calories, but they were eating them for other reasons. Normally what we use during the Pueblo period to get an idea of things going good or bad is it sounds very scientific. It's called the Archaeodactyl Index. And it's just determined by taking the number of archaeodactyls, are like deer, two-pronged feet. You take the number of deer and you divide it by the number of rabbits and deer. And the lower the percentage, the greater the focus on garden hunting and possible for population and environmental stress. So ideally, in the perfect world, more deer, less rabbit. In the not so good world, more rabbit, less deer. Hopefully I can counter the way I do that there. But at any rate, in essence, that's the math of it. The Archaeodactyl Index gets really low in Arroyo Hondo, Pueblo. Like really low to the point where at different time periods, you can look at different levels of deposits to see what the Archaeodactyl Index actually changes over time. It gets worse. This is also the reason possibly why this environmental degradation is possibly why you see Pueblo communities kind of rise and fall during the Pueblo period quite a bit. I'm not saying Chaco Canyon per se, there was other reasons for that, of course. But these Archaeodactyl indexes allow you to provide some sort of data by which you can look at these abandonments, because they do match. So, like the Archaeodactyl index will keep going down on the side of the abandoned, and you go to another site, the Archaeodactyl index will rise again because there's less stress on the environment, and it'll go down, go down, go down. The Pueblo period ends with the arrival of Europeans. That begins with Niza expedition in 1539 and was quickly followed by the Coronado expedition in 1540-1542. I can give a long explanation of how that all went down. I'm not going to. The importance for this lecture, there was a lot of impacts of Europeans. The importance for this lecture is Europeans arrive and they bring with them infectious diseases, they bring with them new peoples, new technologies, and they bring about widespread total war on the Pueblo and nomadic peoples. This leads Native American populations to rebound, and populations to decline rapidly, and the environment to rebound. In fact, if you read European accounts and they talk about the Americas being this untouched, beautiful wilderness, it's because we made it that way, unfortunately, through our infectious diseases. So there are plenty of lands, the diseases go all throughout, unfortunately. Native American peoples are living here in large numbers all throughout the Americas. The diseases come in, they spread quicker than the Europeans are walking. So population levels decline, environments rebound, and then what you have is these areas where you're like, oh my God, it's so beautiful here. There's nobody here, and it's so wonderful, and we can exploit all these resources. Europeans, not purposely necessarily, many people want to blame warfare as the primary pusher for that kind of decline. It really isn't. It's the infectious diseases that really were the motivation for that. But it does lead to Europeans thinking, wow, the land is so beautiful and open with people. And you know what the damning influence here, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent, but it's really one that's dark and creepy. And once you hear it, you probably think of climate change in a completely different way. So we know what the solution to climate change is because we have historical proof of what works for climate change. In the 1500s and 1600s, the Earth went through something known as the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was caused because less carbon went up in the atmosphere, right? That's what you learn about environmental. I'm not saying you have to believe environmental change is wrong. Just hear me out on this one. It's caused by less, you can look at it, there was less stuff in the atmosphere, it all came down, you're like, well, we weren't driving cars in that time period, cars are not necessarily, yes. You know what we did? Through diseases, we managed to eliminate about a quarter of the world's population. And that caused the temperature to drop like 5 degrees over the course of about 50 to 100 years. And as those populations rebounded, the temperature came back up to what it is. But literally, the 17th century is a time period of darkness in Europe, and darkness in China, and darkness in the New World. It was largely caused by the fact that nobody could understand it at the time, but it wasn't that a giant volcano went off and covered the earth and there was no, literally just fewer people on the earth solved the temperature increase. Take that for what it is. It's a harsh, I'm not saying that's the solution. I'm not saying we should allow a monster disease to kill off half the world's population. Though isn't that like Thanos? I don't watch the Marvel movies, but wasn't that his solution or something like that? I'm not arguing for a Thanos solution, but like honestly, that's what happened. So as Europeans get there, the forests grow back, they capture all that carbon from the atmosphere, bada bing, bada boom, nobody's burning fires, the earth kind of goes back, animal populations rebound. And Europeans, more so than Native Americans, who unfortunately have had this population loss happen to them, Europeans are set to capitalize on this newfound boom in items. Okay, so the historic period is a time of technological and societal change. I don't know, only have 10 more minutes left. I can get through it. Or I'm not going to rush too much. I'm going to go like 5 minutes. It's usually broken into 4 periods here in New Mexico. We have the Spanish colonial period, which I would argue is actually 2 separate periods. There's the pre-revolt period, which was completely different from the post-revolt period for the Spanish, but that's an argument that can be made elsewhere. There is the Mexican period, which is relatively short, but incredibly impactful for the way we understand tribal relations, the U.S. government's role in coming into New Mexico. You can't understand it without that small Mexican period kind of anchoring everything together, the American territorial period, and then the New Mexico statehood period. Europeans bring in addition to the environment rebounding, they bring in new animals, domesticated animals, the cow, the pig, the goat, the sheep, and chicken all come into New Mexico. These are adopted by Native American communities quickly, and they offer ready protein sources to reduce the reliance on hunting wild game. We also see the arrival of the horse, which was eaten by most Native American peoples and many European peoples, to be clear. But it transformed both sedentary farmer and mobile hunter-gatherer societies based on the use of the horse, both as a meat product and as a transportation tool to acquire more meat. Certainly in the case of the Comanche, if we use eastern New Mexico and West Texas as an example, the horse completely transforms their society, into which they are able to create their own great empire at the cost of other indigenous peoples. But they are able to create their own great empire on the plains as a result of the arrival of the horse. It's also during this time period, while Native American raiding had occurred in the past, these domesticated animals give and concentrated grain efforts really lead to an increase in raiding, which leads to an increase in conflict between mobile hunter-gatherers and the more sedentary peoples, both Pueblo peoples and European peoples, against these more nomadic peoples. The beauty of hunting a domesticated animal is it doesn't run away from you. It's the best kind of hunt if you were potentially a mobile nomadic hunter-gatherer. My God, this animal's bigger than anything I can hunt, and it doesn't run away. Sweet. To be clear, raiding and hunting are not mutually exclusive activities. I know most people would argue that raiding is a form of warfare. I would really argue that raiding is a resource procurement activity, just like hunting is, that it isn't necessarily, well, it's adjacent to warfare in some ways, because you're taking possibly from other people. It's still more about resource procurement than it is about like a total war aspect that we think of it in kind of a Western tradition. We also see the introduction of firearms. Though, to be clear, firearms are not as big of an impact in the American Southwest as you would think, primarily because they have very limited access to gunpowder and means of fixing these items. So even during the Spanish colonial and Mexican periods, the bow probably took more animals than the gun did. In fact, our military traditions here in the American Southwest during the Spanish colonial and Mexican periods actually follow more in line with the, I'm going to butcher the word, but the Jeanette fighting of Spain during the Middle Ages, this light horse training. You see this with the soldados de cuerva, or the leather-suited soldiers that you can see in the presidios in the 18th century. Those guys are a callback. They use largely lances to fight with. They're incredibly effective in fighting in the American Southwest, but their focus is not on how many guns. The focus is not on gunpowder items as a means of fighting or as a means of taking game. Even the lance was used by Spanish buffalo hunters on the eastern plains, not the firearm. Of course, this kind of changes in the 19th century, certainly with U.S. pushing west. We see New Mexico brought into primarily the Taos area, brought into the mountain man tradition that's going to spread across, which is the fur trade, which is going to reach across from the Mississippi River, pluck those materials, get them down to New Orleans, where they're going to be shipped throughout the world. Taos becomes a major trade center in New Mexico for the commercial hunting practices, first and foremost beaver. And then later on, we're going to see buffalo hunting in the later 19th century with the arrival of the railroad. The kind of commercial hunting that comes in with Euro-Americans is a cash thing. Nobody's eating the gold. They do eat the beaver. Mountain men do eat the beaver. But the focus of the beavers is not to just eat the beaver and live off the beaver. The focus is to kill as many beavers as you can so you get the pelts, so you can get money, so you can buy things, not eat beaver. Similarly, buffalo, interesting, is the same way. Buffalo hunting, unfortunately, comes, yes, they would have loved to eat the meat. They eat a lot of the meat when they were out there hunting buffalo. In fact, Steve Vernell has an amazing book on buffalo hunters. He's actually got several books out on buffalo hunters. He has one right now that he released. I don't think it's available on Audible, so I don't think it's available as a written document. He's like a podcaster / hunting celebrity that does a lot of writing. In fact, he used to write for Outside Magazine in Santa Fe. He used to live in Santa Fe when I was earlier on in my career. He basically, he looks at the evidence and stuff like that. They killed lots of buffalo. They ate as much of the buffalo as they could, but the reality is they couldn't ship the buffalo off to get it processed properly. There was just no money in bringing it back. So instead, you're really looking at getting the hides, processing the hides, and making money off of it. And it's a very short period of time, and the buffalo are all gone. Especially in the southern, interestingly enough, it kind of goes in like this weird, I don't have an American map on here. If you took America as a whole, the middle plains of America gets hit first. Then they kind of move up to the north a little bit. And they hit most of the north. And then they hit the south areas, which had been hunted for generations. And with the railroad, they're able to do what hundreds of years of Spanish and Native Americans couldn't do, was just wipe out the herds in Mexico, in the southern plains of the United States, in like a generation. In New Mexico, we see elk and bison become endangered, if not extinct. And I put that out there as possibly extinct. Now you go, Fires Caldera has lots and lots of elk today. Those are all, I think those are actually from Canada. You tell them to go back, and when you see those elk, you tell them, go back home to Canada. We actually import a lot of elk back, which we'll get to in a bit. But the others, like pronghorn antelope and beaver, saw a major reduction in their native range. So they held on, but just barely. Hunting is, as a result of European entrance into the, of eastern United States entrance into the American Southwest and the commercialized hunting practices that came with that, hunting no longer becomes a viable subsistence activity for anybody. They just wipe out all the animal populations. The response to this is the conservation movement in the early 20th century. The guy who's most associated with it in terms of just general popular ideas, he certainly wasn't the only person in the movement, was President Theodore Roosevelt, who loved the American West and was an avid hunter. He worked very hard to kind of bring about the kind of proper management of the U.S. government, of federal and state governments of lands throughout the United States. And he really popularized hunting not as a subsistence activity, not as a commercial activity, but as a recreational sport. And in my view, hunting had been a sport for many European communities, especially white, wealthy, privileged peoples, for a very long time. He kind of brought the idea of recreational sport hunting to the masses, if you will. He was kind of like even though he was incredibly wealthy, and certainly not an everyday man, he brought that kind of behavior to it. He wrote quite a bit about hunting and his experiences, really trying to transform it. He was also much beloved by a lot of people in New Mexico. If you don't know, many people in New Mexico actually served in New Mexico in the Rough Riders units that he's famous for working with during the Spanish-American War. Has his own aspects of connections with the state. During this time period of change, some animals were introduced and redistributed throughout the state. So if there's small herds somewhere else in the state, they moved them around. Two of the big ones they reintroduced in New Mexico were elk and bison, to try to get those things going again. But they also introduced, during the 20th century, a couple of species that had not been in prior before. Certainly the Persian ibex was given by the Shah of Iran. It now wild populations live in the Florida mountains and around that area. You can actually see them every once in a while, but they're really hard to see. The other one is Namibian oryx, which I bet everybody down here has seen. Interestingly enough, we have an archaeologist, this is an archaeological perspective of hunting, we have an archaeologist to blame for the Namibian oryx living in New Mexico. Hidden, who is an archaeologist at UNM, really liked to hunt in Africa. In fact, he has a head of an elephant in his house, or did. He's dead now. And he was a problematic archaeologist. He said a lot of things that perhaps weren't true. But he brought in the Namibian oryx primarily because he thought it would flourish here and it would offer hunting opportunities. And they were released on white sands, and they've really exploded since then. The Namibian oryx is awesome as far as like surviving in our environment, especially here in southern New Mexico. And they're all over the place now. Now New Mexico actually promotes the hunting of Namibian oryx with a lifetime draw hunt that you can go on and hunt on the White Sands Thistle Range. It is a wonderful hunt if you're looking to do something different. I can tell you right now, as far as meat goes, all human beings descended from Africa and eating things like antelope, and that is actually what, as human beings, we probably should be eating. So the body will recognize that, hey, that's a thing millions of years ago. That's what you should be eating, and we are eating it again. We're also seeing, unfortunately, environmental degradation. The human population, let's be honest here, as bad as it was during the early contact period, the population decline in the Americas, population has gone well above what it ever was prior to European contact now. So environmental degradation has gotten way, way worse. And certain animals that were only in very limited portions of the American Southwest during those Paleoindian, Archaic, and Pueblo periods are now kind of moving north. The big poster child for this is called a peccary. You can see a lot down here. In fact, there's a Deming, a Dairy Queen west of Deming that literally, if you just drive behind the truck stop, it's a truck stop with a Dairy Queen, drive behind there after it rains, they're literally playing. There's a giant wallowing field. You can see hundreds of them playing there. Interestingly enough, that's where the locals direct you to hunt them. When you come down there and they're like, yeah, you should go to the Dairy Queen. And they said, yeah, go there. And anyway, they're there. They have actually really, I would not say they're the greatest meat animals in the world, really, really bad eyesight. I guess that's true maybe of pigs too, but they really have bad eyesight. They've extended further north. It's not uncommon now to have collared peccaries north as far as Albuquerque and stuff like that. They've gone way north of where they were. Okay, hunting today, a wide variety, I'm gonna wrap up now. Hunting today consists of a wide array of both traditional practices and modern sporting activities. Commercial hunting continues sort of, albeit in a highly controlled system, which no longer has a wide market. So there is some, you can be a fur trader in New Mexico. You can have a fur bearer's license. I've had fur bearer's license. You're never going to make, I'll tell you right now, the economy is not there for which you can hunt fur-bearing animals and make a living off it in New Mexico anymore. And I would hope that nobody would try to do that because the amount of effort it would take is just not worth it. Native Americans actually still participate in all three of these systems, but hunting as a means of subsistence remains unviable. Even if Pueblo populations have looked at opening up new hunting opportunities for their members, the honest truth is the population size is so big now that hunting is not viable on those levels. So some conclusions we can start with here today that I hope will take away the key points I hope you take away from this lecture is, first of all, hunting is a cultural expression that extends throughout the entirety of human history. Archaeological evidence is varied and includes things like projectile points, landscape features, and animal bones. In that throughout most of the history that we talked about, the atlatl, bow, or the gun was the hunter's primary tool. If you think of a hunter as holding a rifle or holding a bow, that's not what people throughout most of human history in New Mexico use. They use the atlatl. So I make you feel better if you go out there with a bow. You go, I'm a bow hunter, therefore I'm doing it the old-fashioned, right? Like, yeah, do it with an atlatl. The archaeologists can infer population growth through environmental degradation through the examination of hunting strategies. So certainly, archaeologists can infer population growth and environmental degradation through examination of hunting strategies, which is saying that you can study hunting to learn about how many people are living on the landscape. You can study hunting to tell how well the environment's doing. You don't just study hunting for the purpose of studying hunting because it's cool. You study it to learn more about people as a whole and what's going on. And that hunting is not simply a subsistence practice, it can be a spiritual, commercial, or even recreational activity. And that hunting continues to this day. I mean, obviously, I think most people know that. With that, this is actually me many years ago out in Deming hunting black-tailed jackrabbits. But I will open it up for questions, and thank you very much for